Throughout the annals of human history, few stories have captured the imagination and sparked as much discussion as the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. These ancient cities, whose very names have become synonymous with divine judgment, stand as eternal testimonies to the consequences of unchecked wickedness. While many are familiar with the basic outline of their destruction, fewer understand the profound depth of corruption that led to their ultimate fate. Their story serves not merely as a historical account but as a timeless warning about the consequences of moral decay and divine justice. Before we delve into the specific sins that sealed their fate, let us first understand what these cities were. Situated in the fertile Jordan Valley, Sodom and Gomorrah were not mere settlements, but thriving metropolitan centers of their time. Archaeological evidence suggests they were part of a pentapolis, a network of 5 interconnected cities that dominated the region's trade routes. Their location along major trading paths made them wealthy beyond measure, blessed with resources that most ancient cities could only dream of. The city's prosperity should have been a blessing, a foundation for building a society that reflected divine principles of justice and compassion. Instead, they became object lessons in how abundance, when divorced from moral responsibility, can corrupt the human heart. Their story parallels many great civilizations that followed, from the Roman Empire to modern societies, where material prosperity became a catalyst for moral decay rather than spiritual growth. Like Pompeii, whose citizens awakened to their last day never suspecting their fate, the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah lived in confident prosperity. But unlike Pompeii, whose destruction came from natural causes, these cities faced something far more significant: direct divine intervention. Their story serves not just as historical record, but as a warning that echoes through the ages about the consequences of systematic moral corruption. The first sin, the corruption of justice. The first and perhaps most insidious sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was their systematic perversion of justice. This wasn't merely about corrupt judges or occasional miscarriages of justice. It was about the complete inversion of moral and legal order. Ancient Jewish texts provide shocking details about their legal system that modern readers might find almost unbelievable. According to the Midrash, these cities had established laws that institutionalized evil. For instance, if a stranger arrived seeking shelter, it was illegal to offer them hospitality. If someone was caught giving food to the poor or travelers, they would face severe punishment. One particularly chilling account tells of a young woman who was executed for the crime of giving bread to a beggar. The method of her execution, being stripped, covered in honey and exposed to bees, speaks to the sadistic creativity of their judicial system. The corruption went beyond mere laws. The cities had developed a sophisticated system of social control that rewarded cruelty and punished kindness. Judges were chosen not for their wisdom or integrity, but for their ability to devise new forms of oppression. The wealthy didn't just ignore the poor, they actively persecuted them, using the legal system as their weapon. Traditional Jewish sources describe 4 specific judges who served in Sodom: Shakrai, liar; Shakrurai, awful liar; Zi-Fi, forger; and Mazal Dina, perverter of justice. These names weren't mere epithets but reflected their proud dedication to corrupting justice. They developed elaborate legal precedents that made mockery of true justice. For instance, if someone injured another person's wife causing her to miscarry, they would tell the husband, "Give her to your friend so she may become pregnant again for you." If someone cut off another's ear, they would say, "Pay him until his ear grows back." This perversion of justice was so complete that when Abraham negotiated with God, pleading for the cities to be spared, if 10 righteous people could be found, none could be discovered. This detail is particularly telling. In 2 entire cities, not even 10 individuals remained who hadn't been corrupted by this system. The absence of even this minimal number of righteous people suggests a society where moral corruption had become universal. The second sin, violent hospitality. The second sin represents perhaps the most dramatic inversion of divine principles. In the ancient Near East, hospitality wasn't merely a social nicety, It was a sacred obligation, often meaning the difference between life and death in the harsh desert environment. The way a society treated strangers was seen as a direct reflection of their moral character and their relationship with the divine. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah didn't merely neglect this duty, they actively perverted it into something monstrous. The incident with Lot and the angels serves as the most vivid illustration of this perversion. When divine messengers visited Lot's house, the response of the citizenry revealed the depth of their moral degradation. Ancient Near Eastern customs of hospitality were deeply ingrained and considered sacred across various cultures. Travelers depended on the kindness of strangers for survival, and refusing hospitality was considered not just rude but potentially murderous. The Code of Hammurabi and other ancient legal codes included provisions protecting and mandating hospitality. In this context, Sodom's treatment of strangers wasn't just cruel. It was a fundamental violation of one of the most basic human obligations recognized throughout the ancient world. The biblical account specifically notes that all the people to the last man surrounded Lot's house, demanding access to his guests for the purpose of abuse. This detail is crucial. It wasn't just a few criminal elements, but the entire male population, both young and old, participating in this attempted assault. This universal participation demonstrates that such behavior wasn't considered criminal or even unusual. It was standard cultural practice. Even more revealing is their response to Lot's desperate attempt to protect his guests. When he pleaded with them, reminding them of the sacred duty of hospitality, they turned on him with greater fury, threatening to treat him worse than they had planned to treat his guests. This response shows how completely they had inverted the moral order. Protecting guests was seen as a greater offense than attacking them. Rabbinic literature provides additional accounts of how Sodom treated visitors. They had special beds for guests. If the guest was too short, they would stretch them to fit. If too tall, they would cut off their legs. This grotesque practice symbolizes their approach to hospitality. Rather than adapting their practices to meet the needs of guests, they forced guests to conform to their twisted standards, even if it meant destroying them in the process. The third sin, prosperity's poison. The prophet Ezekiel provides a surprising perspective on Sodom's sin, one that modern readers might find particularly relevant. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. This indictment reveals that Sodom's great sin wasn't just what they did, but what they failed to do with their abundance. These cities had been blessed with extraordinary prosperity. The Jordan Valley, where they were located, was compared to the garden of the Lord in its fertility. They had access to natural resources, trade routes, and agricultural abundance that should have made them beacons of civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests that the region was indeed extraordinarily prosperous during this period. The Dead Sea area was rich in natural resources, including bitumen, salt, and sulfur, which were valuable trade commodities in the ancient world. The cities were positioned along major trade routes that connected Egypt with Mesopotamia, further enhancing their wealth through commerce. Instead, their prosperity became a poison. They used their wealth not as a means to help others, but as a weapon to oppress them. They developed an elaborate culture of leisure and luxury while institutionalizing cruelty toward the poor. Their sin wasn't just greed, it was the deliberate use of abundance to increase suffering rather than alleviate it. Ancient Jewish sources describe how the people of Sodom would mark their coins so they could identify money that came from their city. If a poor person received such a coin, no merchant would sell them food, ensuring they would die of starvation while still clutching the money they had received. This practice symbolizes how they had perverted even the basic purpose of wealth. Rather than using it as a medium of exchange to facilitate human flourishing, they transformed it into a tool of oppression. This aspect of their sin has particular relevance for modern societies. In a world where global wealth exists alongside desperate poverty, where some nations enjoy unprecedented prosperity, while others struggle for basic necessities, the warning is clear. Prosperity itself isn't evil. It's how we use it that matters. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah suggests that the misuse of abundance may be as grave a sin as more dramatic forms of wickedness. The fourth sin, the celebration of evil. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Sodom and Gomorrah's corruption was their pride in it. As Isaiah noted, they parade their sin like Sodom, they do not hide it. This wasn't mere wickedness, it was defiant wickedness. Wickedness that had progressed beyond shame to celebration. This progression represents a particularly dangerous stage in moral decay. When a society moves from tolerating evil to celebrating it, from hiding sin to parading it, it has crossed a threshold from which recovery becomes nearly impossible. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah hadn't just accepted evil, they had redefined it as good and good as evil. Archaeological evidence suggests these cities had developed elaborate cultural ceremonies and festivals that celebrated their perversions. They had created a sophisticated social system that not only permitted evil, but promoted it as virtue. Those who maintained traditional moral standards were mocked and persecuted, while those who invented new forms of wickedness were honored. The Talmud describes how they would hold public ceremonies to celebrate particularly creative acts of cruelty. One account tells of how they would cover a victim in honey and place them near a beehive, then gather to watch and celebrate as the person suffered. These weren't isolated acts of sadism, but community events that reinforced their inverted value system. Even when confronted with supernatural intervention, the blinding of the mob by the angels, they remained defiant. This detail reveals a heart condition beyond mere sin. It shows active rebellion against divine authority itself. They had reached a point where not even miraculous intervention could shake their commitment to evil. The fifth sin, spiritual death. The final and most fundamental sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was their complete spiritual bankruptcy. This wasn't just about rejecting certain moral principles, it was about rejecting the very source of morality itself. They had replaced divine worship with self-worship, divine authority with self-authority, divine truth with self-truth. This spiritual death manifested in every aspect of their society, their laws, their customs, their relationships, their values. They had created a culture entirely divorced from divine reality. Without recognition of divine authority, there was no foundation for morality, no basis for justice, no reason for compassion. They had cut themselves off from the source of life itself. Archaeological findings in the region have uncovered evidence of pagan temples and ritual sites, suggesting these cities had developed elaborate religious systems. However, these weren't genuine expressions of spiritual seeking, but rather sophisticated justifications for their wickedness. They had created gods in their own image, deities that validated their corruption rather than challenging it. The biblical account of God's response to these cities reveals something profound about divine justice. This wasn't a hasty judgment, but a careful process of investigation and verification. The text tells us that God said, "I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know." First, God heard the outcry against these cities. The Hebrew word used here, za'akah, implies not just noise but a cry of distress from victims of injustice. This suggests that the city's victims had been crying out to heaven for intervention. The same word is used to describe the cry of Abel's blood from the ground and the cry of oppressed Israel in Egypt, indicating the severity of the situation. Second, God conducted a personal investigation. The anthropomorphic language used here, God going down to see, teaches us something important about divine justice. Even when wickedness is obvious, God's judgment is never hasty or arbitrary. The text presents this investigation not because God needed to gather information, but to teach us about the thoroughness of divine justice. Third, God allowed for intercession. Abraham's negotiation with God, pleading for the cities to be spared if 10 righteous people could be found, reveals divine willingness to extend mercy if any basis for it exists. This dialogue demonstrates that God's justice is tempered by mercy, and that he is willing to spare the wicked for the sake of the righteous. Fourth, God sent angels to verify the city's condition firsthand. These divine messengers experienced the city's wickedness personally, confirming the justice of their destruction. The angels' visits served multiple purposes: testing the city's response to strangers, providing one final opportunity for repentance, and validating the justice of the coming judgment. Modern archaeology has provided fascinating support for the biblical account. Excavations in the region where these cities are believed to have been located have uncovered evidence of advanced urban centers that were suddenly and catastrophically destroyed. Researchers have discovered layers of ash and sulfur balls embedded in the ruins of ancient cities in the Dead Sea region. The destruction layer shows evidence of intense heat, consistent with the biblical description of fire and brimstone raining from heaven. The temperature required to create the type of destruction evidence found would have been far beyond the capabilities of ancient warfare. Geological studies of the Dead Sea region have revealed evidence of a massive catastrophic event that occurred during the approximate time period described in the biblical account. The destruction appears to have involved multiple mechanisms: intense heat, explosive force, and possibly seismic activity, consistent with the biblical description of fire and brimstone raining from heaven. Furthermore, geological studies suggest the region experienced a massive upheaval, possibly involving earthquake activity and the release of natural gas deposits, which could have provided the mechanism for the divine judgment described in Scripture. The presence of bitumen pits in the region, mentioned in Genesis 14, could have contributed to the catastrophic nature of the destruction. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't merely ancient history, it's a warning for all times. Many of the patterns that led to their destruction can be observed in modern societies. The corruption of justice through legal systems that protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. The perversion of natural relationships and sacred institutions. The use of prosperity for self-indulgence rather than service to others. The celebration of evil and mockery of good. The replacement of divine authority with human autonomy. However, unlike Sodom and Gomorrah, our story isn't finished. We can learn from their mistakes and choose a different path. Their destruction stands as both warning and hope, warning of the consequences of persistent wickedness, but hope that divine justice will ultimately prevail. When judgment finally came, it was swift and complete. The biblical account describes fire and brimstone raining from heaven, suggesting a catastrophic event that completely destroyed these cities. But it's crucial to understand that this destruction wasn't merely punitive. It was protective. Sometimes when evil reaches a certain point, judgment becomes an act of mercy. Mercy for future generations who would otherwise be corrupted by that evil. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah prevented their influence from spreading and corrupting other societies. The destruction of these cities stands as an eternal warning about the consequences of persistent, defiant wickedness. But it also testifies to God's perfect justice and mercy. He gives warning after warning, chance after chance before final judgment falls. We live in a time of grace, but that grace shouldn't be taken for granted. The story of these ancient cities reminds us that while God is patient and merciful, He is also just. There comes a point when divine justice must act. Unlike the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, we have their story as a warning. We can see where their choices led them. We can choose a different path. The question isn't whether God will judge sin, He will. The question is, what will we do with the warning He has given us? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as more than just a historical account of divine judgment. It provides a comprehensive case study in how societies can decline from prosperity to destruction through systematic moral corruption. Their fall wasn't sudden. It was the result of progressive choices that led them further and further from divine truth. The 5 sins we've examined, the corruption of justice, violent hospitality, abuse of prosperity, celebration of evil, and spiritual death, represent a pattern of societal decay that remains relevant today. Each sin built upon the others, creating a downward spiral from which recovery became impossible. But perhaps the most important lesson from their story is that judgment, while certain for unrepentant wickedness, is never God's first choice. The lengthy process of investigation, the opportunity for intercession, and the rescue of the righteous all demonstrate divine mercy operating alongside divine justice. As we face our own societal challenges, the question before us is clear. Will we learn from their example, or are we doomed to repeat their mistakes? The choice, as always, remains ours. Let us choose wisely, remembering that while judgment is certain, mercy is always available to those who turn to God while there is still time.